So in this video we're going to talk about the 1DX Mark III, and this is a camera I've been looking forward to for a long time actually, since the 1DC came out in 2011 or 2012, and at that point that was the most expensive DSLR I've ever set my eyes on. It was about $15,000 when it came out. So this time we've got a more sensible price because it's aimed at a broader market, so they're making more of them, and this is the 1DX Mark III. Now for video, there's a lot more competition and for a small cinema camera than there was in 2012 with the 1DC. So I think we've got to touch on some of the competition in this review and not just go on about the camera in isolation and hype it to death. Because it's very easy to just look at the specs and go, wow, this is incredible. But you've got to see it in the context of the other cameras. And one of them is the Panasonic S1H, which we have here. There's also the Fuji GFX 100, which is my current favourite of all the cameras at the moment. We've got the £1,500 XT4. Now, I know it's not a full frame camera like the others, but there's a Metabone speed booster coming out soon as well, which will make it a lot more capable with Canon EF lenses. So I've tried the existing Canon EF adapters with autofocus for this camera, and I have to say the Fringer adapter is superb. Really like using a native Canon DSLR in terms of the video autofocus. So I've got high hopes for the Metabone speed booster. If that can give me the full frame look and the really good autofocus with the XT4, you've got to start questioning why you want to spend $6,000 or pounds on the 1DX Mark III. Now the XT4 does 10-bit as well. It does 4K 60 frames a second as well, and it does all that with an EVF and an articulated screen, and it's still a nice chunky body with the battery grip attached. So Fuji doing really good stuff at the moment, especially with this and the GFX 100. So just going back to the 1DX Mark III, the 4K 60 image is very good in full frame, and I think the favourite mode of all is probably the 4K 60 at the moment with the digital image stabilization enabled. So with this you have a small crop from full frame of 10%, but it's not all that noticeable, and actually the DIS works really well. It works a bit like IBIS on the Fuji cameras in terms of locking off a handheld shot and you being able to use it a little bit like a gimbal, but not obviously to that level. And then we've got the fact that the full frame 4K 60p is Canon log 10-bit 422. Now the Panasonic S1H, the S1 and the Leica SL2 do not do full frame 4K 60 in 10-bit. So that is something that the 1DX Mark III has over the competition in that respect. So this may sound a little bit controversial, but I actually like the DSLR body, even though it's so obsolete for video. I just like the enormous grip. I have quite big hands anyway, so the small mirrorless cameras feel a little bit cramped in terms of the controls, but not with this. It's got a very good control layout which has evolved over 20 years or even more actually. So I do like the fact that it's a big chunky DSLR. I just don't like the fact so much that it hasn't got an EVF on it, and I don't like the fact that it doesn't have an articulated screen either. An isolated problem that I found with the 1DX Mark III that I have is that when you rotate the jog wheel every 360 degrees, it has like a pop. So obviously something is wrong in the quality control there. And you can hear it now. But apart from that, the EF mount is okay. I prefer the RF mount, so it's worth waiting for the EOS R5 to come out. But the fact that Canon have taken like a $6,000 Pro body and basically put a small cinema camera in it is an interesting approach, and I think Panasonic can learn from this approach a lot in terms of the S1H, because the S1H has everything in terms of the specs and the features and the controls and the articulated screen and the EVF, but what it feels like in the hand is very different, and it feels like Panasonic have taken the cheap mirrorless camera G9 and put a Netflix approved cinema camera in that body. Now if they'd taken a $6,000 body like this and put a cinema camera in it, but with a mirrorless lens mount, EVF articulated screen, wow, that would be some camera. That would blow my mind. But they've taken a rather kind of consumer camera really in terms of the body, and the S1H isn't a cheap body. It's really well built, really solid, but it has the character of the G9. The other thing is the autofocus as well, but we'll touch on that later. The S1H has for $4,000 6K full frame, but only at the cinema frame rates and 30p, which you shouldn't use, let's face it, unless you're completely insane. So 24p and 25p on this camera I'd say is a little bit better than the 24 and 25 cinema 5.5K RAW on the 1DX Mark III, and that is purely down to the fact that there's far less rolling shutter on the S1H, and the rolling shutter on the at the cinema frame rates on the 1DX Mark III is appalling, and it's worse than some of the $600 mirrorless cameras. So that is a major oversight by Canon with the 1DX Mark III. So to avoid that, we have to shoot at 60 frames a second. And this is all very well, but the file sizes in RAW at 60 frames a second are absolutely enormous. We're talking 2,400 megabit per second. And the old 1DC in 4K with the MJPEG codec, we criticise that a lot for its 500 megabit per second file sizes. So good luck with that. I mean, if you're on location and you got those file sizes, you're not going to be happy. And the amount of hard drives and archival over a year for that kind of file size is enormous, which puts it in the domain of a professional Hollywood film studio to handle that much data if you're doing weekly shoots and working really hard with this camera. It's just too big. So I think that the 10-bit is the way to go for most people, and the 4K, the 5.5K RAW just looks very nice on the box, but personally I wouldn't really touch it. And unlike the S1H, there is no ProRes RAW out of the HDMI or the USB-C port, so that is something to consider for sort of the videographers and the kind of smaller studios. Do you want an editable codec, or do you want the Canon RAW with the enormous file sizes? And to be honest, not very good editing performance either. I've been having troubles with that in Resolve, the latest version of Resolve on a very powerful system as well, so that is something to consider. Now the 10-bit H.265, you can shoot that at 4K 60p. There's no 5.5K with that. And there's far less rolling shutter in the 60p than there is in the 24p, and you get the reasonable file sizes with that as well. So I'd say that's probably the sweet spot with this camera, the 4K 60 full frame, with perhaps the option of the digital image stabilization for cropping it slightly and giving you that nice smooth slow motion handheld footage. Very nice. And I compare it to the Leica SL2, and you have to crop to 1.5 times in that for the 60 frames a second. So yeah, it does have its pros for certain, but I think the cons do outweigh the pros in this situation for me. And it may be different for other users, other types of filmmaker, but for me, I'd say that the Canon RAW is unusable, just too big file sizes, and the compatibility with the NLEs is, the editing software is poor. The 32 millisecond rolling shutter is atrocious, so that rules out the cinema frame rates for anything apart from lockdown very static shooting. The disabling of the dual pixel AF in 60p is a problem. One of the biggest selling points of the 1DX Mark III for filmmakers is that autofocus. So if you want to use it without the atrocious rolling shutter, you have to lose the full frame capabilities of the camera. So you're back to the 1.4 times crop of the 1DX Mark II and the 1DC. So that's not ideal either, because you're buying a full frame camera and you're buying one with very good autofocus. So to not be able to use those two aspects together at 60 frames a second is a drawback. And this, if you don't need 4K 60 frames a second, this is the cinema camera for me. Everything is integrated into what you see here, this tiny little body, even though it's enormous by the standard of some of the mirrorless cameras. It's a lot smaller than a Red Epic or a typical cinema camera. Even the FS5, the smallest video camera, dedicated video camera that looks cinematic, is a lot bigger than this. So the other thing to consider is the stills side. I want that all in one body, and boy does this have the stills side. 100 megapixel medium format with the detachable EVF, which can be articulated on a hinge as well, and the articulated screen on the back. I think Fuji are absolutely on fire at the moment with some of the cameras they're putting out. And this reminds me of a XH1 style body in terms of the usability of it, more so than the XT3 and the XT4 series, because it's a little bit less fussy and more professional. The buttons more DSLR-like, more direct, I'd say. And the build quality is superb as well. So I think in terms of the look of the full frame lenses on this as well, in video mode on a full frame camera, even if there's no crop, there's always a crop because of the 16:9 aspect ratio cropping the top and bottom of the sensor from 3:2. So on this it doesn't do that, because the larger sensor, when cropped from 4:3 right down to 16:9 for the widescreen video, is still as tall vertically as a full frame sensor is in stills mode for 3:2 images. So the full rendering of the full frame lens you really do get on this camera in video mode. In stills mode, depends on the lens. Obviously you're going to have problems in 4:3 with the complete medium format sensor and the vignetting. But I'd say that in stills mode, you can use all of Fuji's glass with the Phase Detect AF and the medium format lenses from the past on it as well. So, but for video with full frame lenses, I'd say this is probably the best camera on the market at the moment. You don't get the same sharpness at the very edges of the frame, left and right, as you would on a full frame camera. But then with some lenses you do, especially the longer focal lengths, like at 50 and 85mm, stop down to 5.6. And some of the 85mm lenses are sharp across the frame, like the Sigma 85 f1.4, at 1.4 wide open fast apertures, which looks spectacular on the medium format sensor. So if you want to keep the full frame look for video, I think this is the one to go for. It's like a super full frame camera. And it's £2,000 more expensive than a new 1DX Mark III if you buy it used. And new, it's about £4,000 more. So there is that to consider, and it's definitely in the domain of the professional camera and not the enthusiast camera. But then for Fuji to come out with very similar video specs to this, the 10-bit 4K in the X-T4 with IBIS and actually more features, because this lacks the F-Log view assist that the X-T4 has, and the 4K 60, and the 240 frames 1080, and the 120 frames a second. So actually the X-T4 is better for slow-mo, and you have the view assist for log as well, so that's something to consider. But Fuji, really impressive at the moment, I'd say, out of all the manufacturers.